talking about is feelings, because to be honest, so what if everybody knows that I had a fight with my wife last night? Many people have fights with their wives. Probably most people have fights with their wives and husbands at some stage. It doesn't really make much of a difference, at least not concretely. So what's really the problem? What concrete damages can be occurred from this loss, from this invasion into my personal space? And again, I want to focus on concrete damages and not just on emotional issues, because they have actual ramifications. We want to construct secure solutions to these problems. A concrete damage that comes just from, and I'm going to talk about more issues later, that comes just from this invasion to my personal space is that of self-censorship. Once I know, or I believe, or I fear that what I'm doing online can be traced back to me, I automatically start behaving differently. So it's inhibiting my free speech without necessarily anybody, it's obviously not legally, no one's forcing that inhibition, that limitation of my free speech. But I automatically will start censoring myself when I know or when I fear that what I'm doing online can get out. And here are a few examples. Teenagers on chat sites, we talked about that beforehand. Universities often have forums where students can comment on courses and on lecturers. Now, we'd like the students to be respectful, but we'd also like them to be able to speak honestly, because that's important information for us. But if the students fear that if they say something bad about a lecturer, it's going to get back to that lecturer, then they're going to be afraid to do it. So we'd want, that's also an example of self-censorship. But I think one which I most identify with and I most fear is the limitation on how we use the internet for important information. So there are a lot of sites which I'm doubtful about how reliable the information is there, but there's a lot of very, very important and good information. Medical information. A lot of universities have places where students can post questions about sexual diseases, sexual practices. And it's very, very important that teenagers, college students, and other people, and older people also, can search for medical information, for example, in a private and anonymous way. If all of your Google queries were published, then you would be querying very different things, and you would, it's quite clear that you would stop searching for sensitive information, even though it's very beneficial to you. So the first concrete damage is that of self-censorship, and it's one that is, of course, very severe, but it's only a problem if my online behavior, if my online profile can actually be linked to my real-world identity. Because I'm Andrew Lindell, but when I'm online, I'm an IP address. Okay, so somehow that link has to happen for it to be a problem. Because if the neighborhood knows that someone in the neighborhood had a fight with their wife last night, then of course it wouldn't bother me whatsoever. And this fact that the link is what the problem is actually widely held, it's widely believed. In a poll in 2000, 35% of people said that they were not at all comfortable with profiling their online information, even if it wasn't linked to their real-world identity. So just the mere profiling bothered 35% of people. But when they were asked if that profile would be linked to their real-world identity, the number jumped to 81%. So a vast majority of people are very concerned about profiling, especially when it's linked to their real-world identity. It's my guess, and it's pure speculation, I admit, but it's my guess that 35% who said that they were concerned, even if it wasn't linked, are really concerned because they fear that it may be linked in the future. I agree that it's speculation, but that's what I would guess. In any case, there's a very big gap between linking and not linking in terms of how people feel. So it seems that if I don't link my information, then everything is fine, because no identifier means no invasion of space. Again, if it's 100% guaranteed that a user's profile can never be connected to their identity, and let's assume we have a magical mechanism for guaranteeing that, then we're not going to suffer from self-censorship. What I'm going to try and do now is to convince you that this is a very naive perspective on privacy, and in fact, even if linking does not take place, we can be in very big trouble. Let's look at the example of an online newspaper, a personally tailored newspaper. Okay, it's something which is a very nice idea. It's been thrown around a lot. Everyone has different interests. They're interested in reading different articles. What about having an online newspaper that when I open it in the morning actually presents the articles that are of interest to me? How will it know what interests me? Well, firstly, I can fill in a questionnaire before I start the service. But more importantly, or more interestingly, it can use data mining to learn what I'm interested in by looking at what articles I read, how long I spent on them, in what order, at what time of the month or the year, compare that to other users as well, and build up profiles on what my interests really are when I come to look at a newspaper. And it can give me a tailored newspaper. It's a great idea. However, if we say that our garbage says a lot about us, and it does, right? If someone went through all of our garbage, they'd learn a lot about information about us. What we read in the newspaper says even more. Our political interests, what stocks we're interested in, what our hobbies are, what companies we follow, religious beliefs. A lot of different things can be found in what we read in the newspaper. I don't necessarily want the newspaper to know all of that about me. I don't want that information out there. I don't want it profiled. Now, if my identity is never provided, once again, it seems like that's fine. But this is completely false. Based on this belief that the linking is the only problem, if I had a basic pseudonym that wasn't linked to me, that couldn't be linked to me, then everything would be fine. Let's look at now a concrete problem that could occur even if linking never occurs. A user's profile, as I said, reveals a lot about them. So a newspaper with strong interests could now tailor content to that user. Not just to give them the articles that they're writing in a certain order of what they're interested in, but could also try to actually manipulate them based on their interests. You know that if you're having an argument with someone, a debate with someone, and you know a lot about them, about what they believe and they don't believe, about what their interests are, then you can push a lot of buttons. And if they don't know the same things about you, then you have a significant advantage. So this might sound a bit Big Brother-ish, but it's a real possibility. The newspaper could use its knowledge about you against you without you even being aware that it's doing that. Right? I know that every newspaper has certain political biases, but I also know that everybody's reading the same thing, and here I'm being given something different and not even knowing it. This is something which privacy advocates talk about. It's an infringement on a person's autonomy, because your information can be used against you to manipulate you. And even if I have a pseudonym, it doesn't help whatsoever, because all that's necessary is to manipulate the user standing behind the pseudonym. The newspaper doesn't care about my name, Andrew Lindell. It doesn't matter whatsoever. It's not a matter of knowing about me. It's about using my information. And this is something which most people haven't thought about when they think about privacy concerns. They think about what happens when someone knows information about me. But I'm talking about something completely different, which is what happens when someone can use my information against me. It's a completely different world. Again, industrial espionage. They may not know that I work for Aladdin Knowledge Systems, but they can know that some competitor is interested in researching that product, is developing that product. That in itself is less damaging, but it can still be damaging. Price discrimination, a similar thing. Knowing my personal interests, the way I shop, maybe that I don't shop around, that I don't look for cheaper prices, I can be discriminated against in an unfair way. That's a whole big debate, because economists actually like price discrimination. Consumers don't. When is it fair? When is it unfair? We won't go into it here. So in conclusion of this part of the talk, privacy is much more than being let alone. It's not just a matter of my information going out, but it's about it being used against me. And naive solutions that rely on a pseudonym just don't suffice. What we need is unlinkability between transactions. We need that the different actions that I take every day, the different sessions that I open when I go to my newspaper, when I go to my technical forum, that they cannot be linked between each other. And this is very, very difficult if authentication is required. So if I don't need authentication, then you can imagine that I'll just go through an anonymizing web server every time that I want to go to this site. Then, apart from traffic analysis issues, to a certain extent, I'm pretty well protected. But if I need to authenticate, it's already impossible to do that. Because once I authenticate, I'm telling the server who I am. So we need unlinkability and we need anonymous authentication. Okay? Again, why did I go through this whole thing? You could think that we don't really need anonymous authentication because all I need to do is authenticate under my pseudonym. It's not my real identity. I can sign up for the service under a false identity. We do it all the time. We have to fill in those annoying web forms that ask for our age and salary and everything we do. We just write garbage. So I could do that as well. But again, that's not enough. That doesn't solve the problem, the real problems that can occur with privacy loss. I'm going to spend just a very few minutes talking about anonymous web surfing, and then I'm going to move on to the actual main part of my talk. This is a necessary infrastructure for anonymous authentication simply because if it's possible to track my identity through my IP address or through traffic analysis or through some other means, then it doesn't really help that the authentication protocol that I'm putting on top is anonymous, because it's possible to catch me below that level. There are two basic security goals in anonymous routing. The first is user anonymity. That basically means that I'm going to remove any identifying information from the packets that I'm sending. So if we forget about what's happening on the way, I'm just thinking about the server at the other end. The packets that it receives don't contain any identifying information about me. That's non-trivial, but not too difficult to do. The much more difficult task is that of unlinkability, and that's if we have an adversary who's able to actually look from a global level at the network, and they're going to see who's sending packets and who's receiving packets, without necessarily looking at content, and this is what the previous talk was about, then it's possible to link a client to a server. The aim of anonymous routing is to prevent that or to make it more difficult, or especially if the attacker has only a partial view of the network, it can be more successful. But in any case, I'm going to assume that I have such a mechanism. As I said, the user anonymity is not too difficult, and linkability is actually very difficult. To look at it graphically, I'm going to just take an abstraction and say, I'm going to assume that someone has successfully implemented the level of anonymous routing. There's still more research to be done, but some progress has been made. And it basically works as follows. The clients will send their messages into some magical system, some internal network, which blinds the messages. It permutes them. It does other things, re-encrypts, decrypts and re-encrypts, and sends them on, but where there's not necessarily, we don't know the correlation between A, B, C, and alpha, beta, and gamma. We don't know the correlation, and so therefore it's impossible for someone just looking at this level to see which client is talking to which server. How is it achieved? There are a number of different methods. In the CD, there's actually the presentation is not there, but there's a whole paper which appears there, and you can find these references and also a general survey on how mixed nets work to get a feeling of how these things can be achieved. But at least to some extent they are reasonably successful. It's not simple, the problem's not solved. We're going to assume it here. Okay, the main point. Anonymous authentication, what is it? At least on a more formal and more technical level, and how can it be achieved? I just want to stress that if anybody has any questions, I should have said in the beginning, has any questions about what I'm talking about, please ask. I don't have any problems taking questions throughout the talk, especially if something is not clear or you think that I'm talking nonsense. That's also possible. So what's the high-level idea? It's what I mentioned beforehand. We want anonymous authentication protocol. So as a starting point, we know that to authenticate, you need to know something. So we have to somehow